Welcome to A Space to Speak Your Mind,
a radio programme and a podcast about mental health and wellbeing.
As part of a radio wellbeing group run by Cornwall Mind,
made by people with lived experience.
We do occasionally cover subjects that some listeners may find distressing.
For more information, help and support, please visit cornwallmind.org.
A Space to Speak Your Mind with Cornwall Mind.
Welcome to the July show.
I'm Stephen.
And I'm Clare.
And we're your hosts for this month's programme.
On the programme,
we'll be finding out all about dissociative disorder with Rémy Aquarone, who is the Centre Director of the Pottergate Centre in Norwich.
We'll be learning more about the Cornwall Mind Tennis wellbeing group coming to Penzance this September.
And we'll discover if medical cannabis could help veterans struggling with mental health with Dr Simon Erridge.
First, though, let's hear from Dr Jackie Gray explaining how caring for an elderly relative can have a negative influence on our mental health.
A Space to Speak Your Mind.
The emotional and physical impact that caring for an elderly relative is having on millions of people is resulting in more than half admitting that they have struggled with their mental health because of their caring responsibilities. Dr Jackie Gray has her own experience of caring for her father and the damaging impact she sees daily from the hundreds of carers whom she supports through the charity The Carers Room. And she joins me now, so thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell me a little bit about your own experiences as a carer?
Well, it came as a bit of a shock, to be frank. I had obviously been caring for patients my whole life. And I had recognised that people get older and need support. But until I was actually doing it myself, I hadn't realised just how much support is involved and how complex it is and how difficult it is to actually find the help you need. It affects every walk of life, every aspect of life, every daily task. And it was an eye-opener, and I guess that's why I went on to create the Carers Room.
What were the main things that you maybe didn't realise before that you sort of came into contact with caring for your father?
Well, I suppose I had always seen it through that sort of health lens, the medical lens. But caring for someone is very much about other aspects. As I've said, there's managing their finances, the legal aspects of care, the impact on relationships, on juggling your own life with the needs of someone else and challenging your values about what you hold dearly, I think, really, as well.
And is there something at the moment, do you think, why we are struggling so much? Is it just the pace of life? Are we taking on so much? Or do you think there's something more fundamental at work?
I think there are some real challenges for people who provide care. The people that I work with, carers, they're caring for older people, and they really struggle to find the help and support they need for themselves, but also for the older person. So they're dealing with some very strong emotional issues as they see someone they love really struggle with their health. And on their behalf, they're finding it hard to access support for the older person, and they're not putting their own needs first as well. And it's affecting millions of people. This is a very common problem, unfortunately, in our ageing society.
That's the thing, isn't it? Because, of course, we want to care for our elderly relative and we want the best for them. But also we have to look after ourselves. So how concerning is it when it comes to the mental and physical impact of caring for an elderly person?
Well, what we're seeing is that I think people are putting their own needs second and the person that they're caring for first. But that is taking its toll. So our survey found that over half are neglecting their own health and well-being. They are reporting struggles with their mental health. That's 55% did that. A similar number are struggling with their physical health. And a slightly higher number, 57%, are struggling with their work life and their finances as a consequence too.
It's that thing that we always say, isn't it, about putting self-care first, because if we can't look after ourselves, how do we look after somebody else? And as you're mentioning there, sleep patterns and having that time that we need to be able to care for somebody else.
Yeah, well, I think that's the problem, the lack of time. It's the juggling that is the issue. What I'm seeing, people are juggling work and care. They're often parents themselves, so they've got children that they're trying to bring up and support. So they're struggling at both ends, aren't they? They're squeezed and there's absolutely no time to put in the effort for their own health and well-being. They're grabbing food on the hoof, they haven't got time to exercise, and they're worrying into the night. And as you say, it's affecting their sleep.
And the thing is, we're looking to reach out for support, and luckily there is now support there. So can you tell us why you started the Carers Room and what information and support that you can offer?
So I started the Carers Room because I was very worried that people were struggling and suffering unnecessarily purely for the fact that they couldn't access information or connections with other people. So the Carers Room, it's a digital platform at carents.co.uk. And the idea there is that all the information you could need is under one roof, so that there's financial information, medical information, safety information. I work closely with organisations like Northern Gas Networks and Cadent to try and identify safety products and services that can help older people and carers. But more importantly, I think perhaps, is there's a community there, a community of people who really understand what you're going through. So no parent need ever feel lonely or isolated, because as you probably know, loneliness and isolation are major risk factors for health as well. It's not just mental health that's affected by loneliness, your physical health can be too. And many carers can become very lonely and isolated because the caring job is all consuming.
And sometimes we just don't know where to go for support, and we don't know what's available out there. And having other people that have been through that or are currently going through that, it can just ease the pressure a little bit, can't it? Having someone else that's having that shared experience.
Absolutely. It's that shared experience that we're trying to bring to the fore so that you don't need to look too hard. It's all there, saving you time. And you realise that you're not alone, and your experience, it's hard. But if other people have been there and can talk you through it, guide you through it, that makes it much easier, doesn't it?
And you are making a call for more to be done. So what else can be done?
Well, I think we need to recognise that we have an ageing society, that these numbers are going to grow. And already probably 4 million carers are out there, over half, that's 2 million at least, are struggling with their health. And these numbers are likely to get bigger and bigger as the elderly population grows. So we need to recognise that there's a problem and we need to do something about it. And the first thing is about streamlining support, which is very fragmented currently, making it easier for people to find the support that they need and plan so that they can get support in place so that they don't burn themselves out.
And you've mentioned before the website, so where can people get more support if they need it?
So the website's carents.co.uk. We also provide tips on social media. We have a closed Facebook group as well, because caring can be a very personal thing. That's Carents Lounge on Facebook. So yeah, it's all free. It's there whenever or wherever you need it. It's across the UK. And please do come in.
And we'll put those links in our podcast as well. So if people want to go on to there to find out more information, they can do. But for now, Dr. Jackie Gray, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Richard.
A space to speak your mind with Cornwall Mind.
And thanks to Dr. Jackie Gray for joining us. Now let's hear from Richard chatting to Ian and Ellen from the Penzance Tennis Club.
Cornwall Mind is launching a tennis wellbeing group in September. And as we're right in the middle of Wimbledon, I thought I'd go along to Penzance Tennis Club to find out what it's all about. So I'm with Ian, who is the head coach here at Penzance Tennis Club. What can people expect from the Penzance Tennis Wellbeing Group?
It's a fantastic opportunity for people to come down and give tennis a try and enjoy the physical and mental health benefits of playing tennis. It's a really good sociable sport and meet new people as well as get a bit of exercise, so it's good fun.
And how can mental health be helped by games like tennis?
So first of all, it's a really social activity for people to make friends and meet new people, and so it helps with any sort of loneliness or isolation, and also getting a bit of exercise as well can help with kind of endorphins, which also can have a benefit on your mental health as well, kind of getting to feel good about that.
And what if someone hasn't played for a long time or they've never played before?
Oh, that's no problem at all. We've got lots of rackets that people can borrow, and we give you all the technique that you need to learn how to play, and then you can put it into a match at the end.
And are there any other group sessions? If people enjoy it, they can come along and take part as well?
Yeah, definitely. We've got our rusty rackets. They really welcome all newcomers. So after you finish the course, if you'd like to do a bit more tennis, then you can come and join us here.
And you also have a walking group, don't you, and other groups that you run?
Yeah, so we run walking tennis on a Monday at 11 o'clock, and that's great for people who might have mobility issues. And so that's really good for people to get into tennis if they don't feel like traditional tennis is quite at their speed. And so, yeah, we have lots of people to participate in other kind of types of tennis.
And I'm now with Ellen, who's the coach for the Wellbeing Group. So Ellen, what format do the sessions take?
So normally we start off learning a little bit about the technique. So we pick up a particular shot for the day, and then we'll look at the technique for that. Lots of closed practice, so they get to hit lots of balls and try it out, and then throughout the session we'll start moving it on, maybe putting it into some rallies, and then maybe even moving it into match play when they're feeling confident.
And what if someone is a bit nervous about coming along?
That's absolutely understandable, but we welcome everyone into the groups. We have lots of fun. There's absolutely no pressure on anybody at all, so we like to take it at everyone's speed, and if somebody's feeling a little bit nervous, take it nice and gentle, get to know the players, and we'll have a good laugh.
And is it free to come along?
It is, yes.
And what would you say to anyone who's thinking about coming along but isn't quite so sure?
I'd say definitely do it. You get to meet so many new people, get to try something different or try something that maybe you haven't done for a while, and just have a really good time. And it's gorgeous sunshine at the moment, so what a great opportunity to be out in the sun.
Well, thank you both for joining me. I think I'm all set now to go off and play some games. If you want more details, just click on the referral form on any page of the Cornwall Mind website, and someone will be in touch to give you more information nearer the time.
Thanks again to Ian and Ellen for joining us. Now, we welcome to the show Rémy Aquarone, Centre Director of the Pottergate Centre in Norwich, joining us along with A Space to Speak Your Mind's Victoria.
A Space to Speak Your Mind with Cornwall Mind.
We have Rémy Aquarone, the Centre Director at the Pottergate Centre in Norwich on the line. Hi Rémy.
Hi Victoria.
And here we have
Steve
and Claire.
And we'd like to know a bit more about dissociative disorders and the work that you're doing at your centre.
More than happy. I mean, just to give you a background to me, I trained originally as a psychoanalyst. That's going back about 40 years ago, a bit more. Then, as happens to a lot of people who are working with therapy, with people who've had difficult traumatic backgrounds as children, someone appeared that didn't really fit any of the normal criteria I was trained with. So it required really doing a lot of training and learning about this condition, which used to be seen as extremely rare, but actually is very prevalent and probably similar to levels of people who are diagnosed as having schizophrenia or similar ones. It's a very hidden condition.
Absolutely. So would you like to tell us a bit more about dissociative disorders and what that really means for people?
First of all, to say that we all use dissociation in some form or other in our daily lives. So it's not something about having dissociation that itself is an issue. It's where it impacts in such a way that actually it gets in the way of being able to have the sort of life you might want to have as an individual. So things like, we may not be aware of it, but if you're seeing something really hard to manage on television to do what may be going on in a world conflict, you naturally filter what you take in and what you don't take in. So that's a sort of natural protection from not being overwhelmed. But there are also pleasurable sides to this, which is like if you're going to the theatre or reading a book or seeing a film, you let yourself sort of disappear in the scene or in the story, which is a way of being able to appreciate. So you forget surroundings around you till the curtain comes down or till you get up or till you close the book, and that is a natural way of being able to reconnect with the environment around you. Now, when it's used in a more extreme way, it's something, certainly the most extreme form, which is DID, dissociative identity disorder. That is something that virtually always starts in very early childhood, nearly always before the age of 5, in which basically it's the most primitive form of protection of your brain to be able to deal with things that actually otherwise you would be in meltdown, you wouldn't be able to deal with. Now, that's not a conscious thing at that age. This is something where the brain, in a sense, goes to the equivalent, it's a psychological equivalent of a coma. So you just shut off from what is not bearable to one in which you're not aware of it, and the amnesia and the changing to another part helps you not experience that danger or that trauma or that abuse, because in a way you were never witness to it. So that becomes, at the time, a most successful, you could say, way of dealing with an impossible situation. Now what happens is, when you grow into an adult, this may be happening again and again, and the more you've had to do something like any defense system early on, as you get older, it becomes a more conscious thing to some extent. But actually you find any situation that appears to be difficult, you're going to do the same thing and not be aware of what's going on.
So it's the brain's sort of natural protection mechanism then, in a way?
In a sense, it starts as a life-saving protection, which in a way has parallels, you could say, that someone who is having to fight in a war as a soldier and the training goes into it, you are actually protected from taking in the reality of butchering people that you're firing on, because you're disconnected from that reality. You're trained, it's a training more than a survival system in early childhood, to be able to not think about the person you are shooting at, but just to think that unless you shoot first, you're going to be the one to die first. So the tendency, as a general principle, is you shoot first and you ask questions afterwards. As an adult, you find yourself reacting to things without having time to actually think about whether that's what you want to do.
It's Steve here. Do you find this more common in males or females, or is it sort of fairly split between the genders?
Well, it's a good question. It has always been predominantly, till about 10 years ago, I guess, something that women would be more likely to live with. Put it this way, more likely to be known about. Because gross generalization, I guess, first of all, men have been less likely for many years to actually seek help. There is that sense of not seeking help. But also, in a very generalized way, men have been more likely, and I am generalizing, men have been more likely to find other ways of coping with what's unbearable, either, which may still be DID, but by things like alcohol, by drugs, by even criminal, anything that takes your mind off catching up with the trauma.
This is Clare. I'd like to ask the questions. You say it's more prevalent in girls, women. Is there a linkage with PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder? Can that lead to dissociative disorder?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, first of all, things have changed. Just to finish that bit, is that now you get probably about a quarter people coming for help are likely to be men. That's because the culture's changed as well, partly. Boys and men are more likely to be allowed to be aware of some of their feelings about it. That can only be good, and we notice that in terms of how men are able to express generally their emotions in a much more healthy way than they used to. Again, a generalization. Now, your question is really that what helps is to see this as a continuum, is that PTSD on itself creates similar temporary ways of dealing with it. So that someone who witnesses an accident, someone who is part of an accident, someone who actually witnesses a trauma near them or themselves are more likely to separate out the thinking about it to the emotional impact. So there is a sort of separation, and some people have no memory of what's happened, whether it's a car accident, whether something dangerous has happened, and it's only afterwards that they would start to recall that. What then happens if something like that also triggers an experience to do with early childhood trauma, then that's likely to compound itself, and ultimately what's seen psychiatrically as what starts as PTSD can become what's called complex PTSD, and at the end of the line is what's called dissociative disorder, and the extreme version of that is DID. So yes.
Have you had an increase in people coming forward to recognise this condition in themselves, or you kind of diagnose them with it?
Huge increase, not only increase in younger people coming up with this because they are more informed about it, they're more likely to have seen that other people have expressed this. And of course this is something that's been hidden because there's a sense of shame and also wanting to try and fit into everybody else and not accept, and that happens to other conditions of course, not want to be seen as sticking out. But the other main thing which has been unfortunate, to say the least, is that for so long within psychiatry, if anyone talked about hearing voices, no distinction was made between whether those voices were more, in a sense, psychotic because they were unrelated to anything and seemed to come out of the blue, or voices that really were the churning up of memories that were being experienced as separate voices from the trauma that happened in early childhood. So that people were then very careful not to reveal that for fear that they would be put on some antipsychotic drug when it wasn't necessary.
Absolutely. So is there a real linkage with psychosis and schizophrenia as well?
Well, it's also like borderline personality disorder, is that some of the symptoms overlap. The difficulty is when people don't ask enough questions, and the other real difficulty is that, unfortunately, still, with a few good exceptions in this country, psychiatrists, who are mostly male psychiatrists, will tend to be of the old school that GPs used to be and tend to be less so, where they know the right way forward. They only accept the idea of one identity, which none of us have one identity. It depends on different stages of our lives. And then we'll say, we'll not ask enough questions. We'll actually insist that the person has to follow what they are prescribing, which most of the time, because of pressure on work for them, is likely to be medication. And that doesn't work in most cases.
Yeah, well, hopefully this podcast will help people recognise maybe the symptoms in themselves and bring more people forward.
I think that would be great.
So what are the ways that the disorders can be diagnosed?
There's several things to think about. First of all, someone has got to want to be at a place where that might be helpful, because you have to remember that this is a brain protection. And if somehow you might feel, or friends might feel, that this is clearly coming out because they're seeing someone behave differently at different times, but if that person isn't at a place where it's safe to acknowledge that, then it's better not to start trying to dissect that by trying to have a diagnosis. But this is not a condition that just hits one type of person. All sorts of people can get this, from someone really high functioning to someone who is less functioning or having other issues that are difficult. It doesn't have boundaries as far as that's concerned. The most important thing, first of all, is for someone to be able to have access to literature about it. But also there are two screening instruments. One is called the DES, the Dissociative Experience Scale, and the other one is called the SDQ-20, which is the Somatic Dissociative Questionnaire. Those are things to look at what the body may reveal about dissociation, because for a long time it was considered it was more how a person talked about themselves, but you can find that the body itself is carrying some of that trauma. Now, that is filled by the person themselves and can be scored by, usually there are ways of scoring yourself, but of course we're always happy to people to send it to us or to ask for it, and we'll score it for them. There isn't a charge for that. That will start giving an indication of what the levels of dissociation is, and what the likelihood is that they might have a dissociative disorder, but that can only be confirmed, if that's important, if they get a what's called a full assessment. Now, the difficulty is, if you're trying to get the help within the mental health, that is a lottery thing, because a lot of NHS secondary services do not recognise it or even think it exists, let alone know how to treat it. So they try to treat it in these very short-term cognitive treatments, which can work for some people but will not work, where the basic bottom line of what's gone on is an early attachment between a parent or responsible adult and a child or baby, is something goes wrong about that. It needs long-term work to be able to build up that trust.
How do you find the medical profession sort of take this in general when people maybe present to their doctor or a sort of healthcare mental practitioner?
Well, for a long, long time, most of the work was 35 years ago, work was done mostly in the private and voluntary sector. Now, I think partly because often someone with this condition that's undiagnosed, nothing that's offered will work, so they'll keep coming back to the mental health service and keep getting re-traumatized, because unfortunately there can be a very unkindly way of trying to deal with this. So some trusts have begun to start realizing the importance not only of recognizing it, they used to then send people out to us as well, but what we're encouraging now is really for them to set up the right service. Now, from my experience, if you think of Cornwall, I don't have any knowledge of anything going on there. I may be wrong, but I generally know, which then means there's a lot of preparatory work to try and engage, to try and get them to stop listening to this and to take this seriously.
Absolutely. So would people have to come to you for those screening instruments?
For the screening instruments, well, that's what we do a lot of. They don't have to. They can get it online, both of those. They may find that there's a voluntary service in their area. They can certainly get the ways of probably scoring themselves, but I think it's quite important for them to feel the validation that this is scored, that this is where they fit in, which they could be the first step to take it in if they wanted that, and or they chose to do it themselves, to their GP to try and say, this is something that's, here's the pedigree of these screening instruments, this is where it fits in, and it fits into both psychiatric manuals. It exists as a condition for over 30 years, to try and begin to educate and get some sort of gentle prodding to get the right help.
Do you think that there's people out there that are suffering from this disorder, but they're not necessarily aware that they actually have it? We said that some young children have it, and maybe they're suffering in silence, and they haven't reached out to the support that could be possibly available to them.
It's a very important, difficult question, because first of all, sometimes one of the difficulties can be generally with some therapy for children is that helping can mean opening up something that then gets them into more difficulties or more trouble. If they're not aware of it as a child, I'd be very cautious, because it's back to saying maybe it's not the right time and they have to wait till they're in the right environment. If it's picked up by a teacher, obviously, and there is in the locality a good service to try and help children, then that would be really a good start with someone who knew about it. And in working with children, it's not necessarily that you do what you do with adults, because by the time they're adults, it's very templated in. So you talk about and you relate to whatever part comes out. As a dissociative part, the language is different with a child, because you're encouraging them to embrace all of them and to help to learn to manage what may be a part of them that is violent or in distress, so that they begin to feel that this can be done under their control rather than something taken away from them. These are difficult areas, obviously.
Is this something that you found is generally best dealt with on a one-to-one basis, or is it ever dealt with in a group scenario?
Again, a good question. I think what you've got is someone that early on, right from the start, their first primary connection, which every baby child, just like a duckling, is you've got to attach to someone in order to survive. That's not thought about, that's just inbuilt. So that at that moment, it's not about choosing. There's no ability to choose a good connection, a good or bad. It's knowing that survival is by connecting. So that people who are in an environment where paradoxically they're left completely neglected all the time, the outcome is worse than someone who's connected with one person who abuses them, because there at least there's a connection. Now, I'm not trying to say that any of that's okay, but if that connection is there, then that's a starting point. Then it's about having to then slowly, if that's their experience of adults, and that's why people trying to get help from secondary service when secondary services are doing the best, it's difficult and challenging, because their experience of life, and even during their adulthood, is that people have always got an agenda, that people who do hold power have got an agenda to harm them. And so if that person uses a very patronizing or controlling voice in trying to help the adult or child, then obviously they're going to be triggered into the same sense that they're in danger. And they'll either become very compliant, or they'll start swearing at the other person, and then they find that their help is being cut off, because people will say, we don't tolerate any sort of abusive behavior. And there's a really important distinction between physical, violent, abusive and verbal feelings, because if someone has lived with that, there's going to be rage, of course, that needs to be listened to.
What advice would you give someone that was suffering from a dissociative disorder? Would you tell them to seek medical help? For example, is there counselling available? You were talking about being more educated about this topic. If you think about short-term, what is available, as opposed to long-term?
So it depends, I guess, obviously each individual is different. But if you were seeing someone who clearly was aware that something was going on, that something wasn't right, that they lost time, which would be one of the indicators, that they actually found that people are saying they're lying when they're not, because they're not present at the time, if you understand. If they find that actually they feel out of control because of that, because they find themselves in situations that they have no awareness of having got there, then to talk about it, that this is A, to reassure them that the likelihood is it's not something that's psychotic or crazy, it certainly isn't, and B, to be able to say that if they are able to begin to read up about some of this, and there are books for children as well as for adults, in the short term, is to get them to try and be willing to try and explore inside themselves if they've got no one else around, and to try and get to understand how that system works for them. So rather than seeing that the enemy is inside, because often people will say, I hate these voices, get rid of them for me, which doesn't work with dissociation. It's about saying they've been there for a reason. The problem isn't inside. This problem may be about what you had to endure, and what they did is helped you survive at the time, whatever's going on for you. And one start is for you to start being open to at least not necessarily agree with what's going on, but to try and access what's happening. Maybe write in a book. See what happens when you write in a book. Ask questions to inside you. So that there's a lot of work someone can begin to do themselves. And of course, it may be that feels at one level safer because you're not dealing with another individual. That's the first step, is to gauge, is someone being sent for help because it's someone else who thinks they need help, which doesn't usually work, or someone who is at a point where to continue as they are doesn't feel okay enough, so they need to try and begin, and willing to begin to see what else, and sort of education, knowledge about what it is an appropriate control and gives a sense of power, which is important.
You mentioned books. Is there any particular book or author which you would recommend to the listener?
There are so many. I would say I can't think of any specific because they all will depend what fits in, but what I would suggest, and it's important with someone like that they can be empowered to be part of looking to see what's going on. So rather than we trying our best to keep feeding something, because then the answer is that's the expectation from life, is that they're waiting to be told what they need to do. So I would say, well, type in dissociation, type in some of the things you experience and see what comes up, or look under books and you'll see, depending on your age, and even if someone's an adult, if they've got young parts within them, then there'll be books, if you look under dissociation for children, that come up, which, like any child book, some will resonate and others won't. What doesn't help is probably, unless someone is adult, high functioning, and wants theoretical knowledge to be able to use that, but some people want that as a start, to look at the research and all of that.
You mentioned those that are high functioning. So how would someone high functioning, holding down a job, maybe having a family, how would they even know that they've got this when they go to their GP?
Very good point, because one of the things that someone who's high functioning, if they've got DID or serious dissociative disorder, part of the high functioning, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be there, but it's about being busy in order to keep at bay the fear that something about their past is going to catch up with them. Some people do that when they're exercising again and again and again, all the time, so in a sense there's no room for anything else. But what tends to happen, it gets to a point, sometimes that's triggered by something, sometimes that's age, sometimes it's having a child of your own, that something then begins to leak out at work. So they find themselves at work, something happening. It might be a losing time, it might be an expression or an explosion which is not under their control, and they're embarrassed about it and apologize because they're not normally seen that way, or an interruption in their normal ability to understand what's going on that makes them realize that something isn't working, and very frightened about that. And so that is more likely to be the time when then something is then interrupting enough the routine to be able to feel I've got to do something about it.
Does this also have any links with ADHD?
Well, it's interesting again, because what's happening more and more is that often someone who ends up having a DID may well also have elements of ADHD and autism. Now, it's a very interesting area that needs more research, but when you think about DID as an interruption, as a normal developmental process of a baby to an adult, then at certain young times when something goes seriously wrong, not only is the trauma held by that age, if you see what I mean, but that part of that person is stuck developmentally at that age. Someone who at the age of 5 was subjected to a traumatic event or abuse event, then in order to survive automatically, the person who normally functions isn't there. That part that when they come out, or in some of the behavior, may well be what would be normal in someone that age, but normal someone that age with a trauma experience, but what might be seen as something that is covering the whole of that person rather than just an aspect of that person because of what was interrupted, whether it's ADHD or whether it's, for that matter, it could be what's labeled borderline personality. That person for that age isn't borderline, it's just as that bit of that person was activated. So there is much more overlaps. Now, if it turns out someone has DID, then what I've been encouraging is not to try to get treatment for each individual condition, but to try and see it within the DID treatment framework, which is mostly about developing a trusting relationship so that issues that weren't possible to talk about can be explored with the therapist, with whatever part of that person, not only the adult functioning part, but other parts when they come out, to be able to process what was never possible to to process at the age.
Thank you so much for that. Just before we go, would you like to tell us what the Pottergate Centre does and how you are helping people with dissociative disorders?
Well, what we used to do is be able to, we've always done a lot of assessments. We've been linking, when we were locally in Norwich, with a local trust to try and slowly get that recognised. And it's changed, and we then developed a framework of therapists across the country where they could either see someone privately if there was either means for paying or funding was found from somewhere, or if they got funding sometimes through the NHS. What's happened now is that we felt we needed, in a way ethically, apart from anything else, to make sure that this unmet need is actually encouraged within mental health NHS, because otherwise this then becomes something that is only possible for people who have the money to get help with. And so our focus now, apart from assessing and helping people get screening instruments and getting links with their GPs, is to be able to train and encourage local NHS secondary services to develop an outpatient program that can't go through the whole of that treatment, but can at least offer enough length of time, like 2 years, to be able to start a process where actually someone's quality of life and ability to take this forward is changed radically.
Thank you so much. It's been so informative, and I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people to hear all about this.
Well, not at all, and thank you for doing the work you're doing as well.
To find out more about what we've been talking about today,
go to the website dissociation.co.uk.
A space to speak your mind with Cornwall Mind.
Now let's discover if medical cannabis could help veterans struggling with mental health with Dr Simon Erridge, talking to Richard.
Medical cannabis has been legal since 2018, allowing its use for treating chronic conditions under specific circumstances. Since the passing of the law, medical cannabis is permitted for individuals with exceptional clinical needs when at least 2 other treatments have been proven ineffective. Nearly 1 in 10 veterans have tried medical cannabis to support their mental health symptoms, and 45% are interested in exploring it as an alternative therapy. The majority of those who have tried it report that it has helped manage their symptoms. To find out more, I'm joined by Dr Simon Erridge, who's the Director of Research at Curaleaf Clinic. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Richard.
Tell me what else the report has found.
Yeah, so I think the key things that we picked up here were really around the struggles that UK veterans are having with their mental health. We see a number of veterans are now turning to medical cannabis, and what we wanted to find out, what was the scope of mental health problems amongst veterans. So we found that almost 7 in 10 were facing daily mental health struggles, and indeed 1 in 2 had a diagnosed mental health condition. And when you scale that up across the UK veteran population, that's over 800,000 UK veterans out there with a diagnosed mental health condition, which is obviously a huge number.
And tell me about the research that's being found about the medical cannabis and how it's helping veterans.
So at Curaleaf Clinic, we set up the UK Medical Cannabis Registry to really move forward the amount of evidence that we have around medical cannabis and its use for all conditions that we see, including PTSD. And we published some data last year looking at changes over the first 6 months of management with medical cannabis. What we were able to see was reductions in PTSD-related symptoms, as well as some of the other changes such as anxiety and sleep. Obviously, the important thing is medical cannabis is not a panacea. It's not going to work for everybody. But for those people who were part of that study, we saw some really interesting effects.
And how long has this study been going on?
So we set up the UK Medical Cannabis Registry back in December 2019. Curaleaf were the first clinic to be registered with the CQC here in England, and we see patients right across the UK. And we thought it was really important when treating people with medical cannabis that we're developing the evidence base alongside that. So we now have over 20,000 individuals who are enrolled on the UK Medical Cannabis Registry.
And what are the obstacles that you've faced, and what are the next steps to make this more available?
I think one of the major obstacles that we face is really about raising that awareness. We've done some national surveys through polling organisations that suggest up to 1 in 2 individuals are still unaware that medical cannabis can be prescribed for eligible patients here in the UK. And so if people just don't know about it, it's obviously very difficult for them to go about doing their own research and exploring if that's an option for them. And I think one of the key barriers that we've found in terms of for patients that kind of plays into that is around the research onto medical cannabis. Because the law change obviously happened only so recently, there hasn't been that higher level randomized controlled trial research around medical cannabis. And as such, it's currently not available on the NHS for the vast number of conditions that we prescribe it for. And as a result, that means that people find it difficult to have conversations maybe with their GP or with their specialist around it. Those are 2 key barriers that we face.
And you mentioned for PTSD and other mental health conditions that you're finding it's helping with. And what are the symptoms that it's being able to alleviate, and how are people managing their lives because of it?
We find that particularly with respect to mental health conditions, it's those with a high anxiety or a fear component to them that we're seeing more patients around. So, for instance, the individuals with PTSD, as we've already talked about, but those with generalized anxieties, phobias, or indeed any other anxiety condition. We do see people with depression as well, but typically, again, that tends to be more people with maybe mixed anxiety, depression, as well as individuals with ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, where anxiety or maybe sleep disruption plays a major part in some of the challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis.
And has the medical cannabis been used as part of a wider recovery path? Are there other resources that are available at the same time, such as therapy? And have you noticed that making an extra difference, or is it just solely being used on its own?
What we specialise in is particularly around the prescribing of medical cannabis, but obviously we appreciate that there needs to be a broad spectrum of different therapies that go alongside that. So we obviously emphasise the importance of having therapy, whether that be trauma-focused CBT or EMDR or whatever it may be, and either normally before trying medical cannabis, because there's obviously more evidence around their benefits for individuals with PTSD, but if they have it, then certainly alongside medical cannabis. There hasn't really been many studies that have looked at combining the two in the same population compared to, say, the psychedelics research that's coming out, which is more around sort of psychedelic assisted therapy. Medical cannabis is typically prescribed in a way in which you'd be more familiar with other medications, whereby you take it on a regular day-to-day basis.
And do you think this could be brought out for a wider group of people in the future?
Certainly. I think the key thing is obviously we need to do the right research in order to be able to change that. But what I'd really like to see is investment from the industry, government, charities, whoever it may be, in developing that research base, because I see no reason why medical cannabis may not play a role within a formalised treatment pathway in the future.
And can you just tell me a bit more? You have touched on it briefly about the Curaleaf Clinic, about how it was set up and your ethos, and maybe, again, going forward with what you'd like to do.
Yeah, so we were originally set up by a group of doctors based in London initially, but we have spread our wings a bit further than that now. And really our main ethos is we were all not just doctors, but also scientists at the same time. So the key things for us were about developing a robust amount of evidence out of the work that we're doing, but also making sure that we're delivering a high level of care to patients on an individual basis. So those are the two key things that were really important to us as we were setting up the clinic. And as I said, we were the first clinic to be set up in the UK. We now have tens of thousands of patients that we're seeing right across the British Isles. And we seem to be getting more and more inquiries on a daily basis. I think as awareness grows and as what we're seeing is particularly the stigma towards medical cannabis starting to come down now as well.
So what would your advice be maybe for veterans that are listening at the moment who are relating to what we're talking about? What would be the next step for them?
Yeah, I guess it depends on where they are. If they haven't sought any help yet, I think the first port of call has to be going and seeking out local help, whether that be via a GP or a local therapy service, whichever one that may be. But if they are someone who has tried medications, tried therapies, and that still hasn't been effective for them, then they can go to maybe curaleafclinic.com. We have more information about what medical cannabis is, but importantly, we also have an eligibility checker. So before someone has to make the step towards booking an appointment, they can see, oh, actually, I would meet the legal eligibility criteria, so I can go ahead and book an appointment with one of our psychiatrists to have a sort of more further in-depth chat to not only assess whether they're eligible, but, a suitable candidate as well.
And you also have an access scheme. Can you tell me about that, please?
Yeah, of course. So we have two access schemes. One is the Curaleaf Access Scheme, which helps reduce the cost of appointments to £50 each. And then those people contribute to the UK Medical Cannabis Registry. But more importantly, around today's discussion, we have the Veterans Access Scheme, whereby we offer 5 free appointments every year to veterans to help reduce the cost of accessing care.
And just remind us again where they can get support and find out more about that.
That's at curaleafclinic.com.
That's Dr Simon Erridge, who's the Director of Research at Curaleaf Clinic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thanks again to Dr Simon Erridge.
That's all for this month's show.
Thanks for listening, and we look forward to you joining us for the August show.
If you've missed anything on today's show, you can download the podcast right now on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon Podcasts.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear the new episode when it comes out, or listen back to any of our previous programmes.
For support and more information for better mental health, visit cornwallmind.org.
Or call the Mind helpline during office hours.
on 0300 123 3393.
There is a 24/7 NHS local urgent mental health response phone line.
It's free to access by anyone at any age.
On 0800 038 5300.
And don't forget, you can also call the Samaritans anytime for free
on 116 123.
If you'd like to be part of the show, you can get in contact. Just email aspacetospeakyourmind@gmail.com.
And you can also find out more about the show if you follow Cornwall Mind on Facebook or Instagram or on their website cornwallmind.org.